Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a concept that feels both incredibly solid and present in our world, and yet, as our source material reveals, is fundamentally an idea, a human construct. We're talking about whiteness.
That's right. And this deep dive, it's rooted in some really fascinating, detailed academic exploration, looking at the history of how this idea of white has been built, defined, and redefined over centuries, particularly here in America.
Yeah, tracing it through like discourse, commentary, research, how people have thought about difference and identity.
Exactly. And the mission today really is to journey through that complex history, from antiquity right up to basically the present day.
We want to see just how surprising, how flexible, and how contested this definition of white has actually been.
The historical record shows us pretty clearly that while race is an idea, a social construct, its consequences have been incredibly real, shaping laws, economies, individual experiences, you name it.
So where does this idea of, categorizing people and assigning traits based on perceived group differences really begin? Let's go way back to the ancient world. Where do we start?
Well, we can certainly find early examples of this kind of thinking. Thinkers like Hippocrates, for instance, were already linking variations in human populations, things like physique, temperament, to environmental factors, specifically climate.
Right. He had that view, didn't he, about people in Asia being feeble compared to Europeans because the climate was milder.
That was part of his argument, yeah. He suggested the lack of sharp signal changes somehow retarded development. But he also, and this is crucial, linked these perceived differences to political systems.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, monarchy, he argued, made men cowardly because their bravery, it only served to aggrandize their lords, while their own reward was just danger and death, unlike free men who fought for themselves.
So even way back then, you have climate and political organization being used to explain perceived group differences. Even things like character traits, courage, vigor.
Right. And if we look at Herodotus, his accounts of groups like the Scythians near the Black Sea, they also link perceived character to status and power dynamics. He tells this story.
The one with the whips?
That's the one. Scythian warriors fighting their half-slave children who'd risen up. The warriors were losing, apparently, so they dropped their weapons and picked up whips, the kind used for slaves. And Herodotus claims the children, just seeing the whips, immediately fled, which supposedly proved their innate slavish character.
Wow. So the mere sight of a whip was taken as proof of their fundamental nature. That's a really powerful image linking status and perceived character.
It's a stark example, isn't it? How power dynamics were interpreted through this lens of inherent traits. And Herodotus, he mentions slavery very matter-of-factly throughout his work. It was common across ancient societies, Greek or barbarian, highlighting its pervasive presence as an institution tied to status, conquest.
Speaking of conquest and slavery, this brings us to the early slave trade networks. We often think primarily of the transatlantic slave trade, maybe, but there were much older systems, weren't there? Particularly originating from Eastern Europe.
Yes, absolutely. Notably around the Black Sea region, places like Thrace and Colchis were major sources for literally millennia. You had impoverished parents selling children, kidnappers, famine, warfare, all feeding people into the market.
And this is where we get that crucial linguistic link.
Exactly. The word Slav, referring to people from that broader region, it actually evolved into the word slave in several European languages.
Slav became slave. That's a direct etymological link. It showed that originally geography, vulnerability, political power that determined who was enslaved, not necessarily a concept of fixed race like we think of it today.
It underscores that the targets of enslavement were diverse, often defined by geography and power imbalances. And descriptions from these regions, like those of the Mingrelians near the Black Sea from accounts like Chardin's in the 17th century, they really reinforce this.
How were they described?
In incredibly negative terms. Savages, drunkards, immoral, even having a notable bodily stench, apparently. And who visited them? Almost exclusively slave traders. So it's an early, vivid example of linking perceived negative traits, physical, moral, behavioral, to specific groups targeted for enslavement. It created this narrative that, justified their exploitation.
So these ancient and early modern ideas, climate, politics, character linked to status, geography, negative traits associated with vulnerable groups. They were all circulating, forming this complex backdrop long before maybe formalized pseudoscientific racial categories really solidified.
Absolutely. They laid some of the early groundwork, you could say, for later, more rigid thinking about fixed inherent differences between peoples and which groups were sort of naturally suited for higher or lower status.
Okay, fast forward a bit.
Yeah.
We see this history of white slavery continuing, even as the transatlantic trade is ramping up significantly. The sources mention Robinson Crusoe's own experience with this.
Yes, in Defoe's novel, Crusoe himself is enslaved by pirates in North Africa. He serves for 2 years alongside other slaves, including a young Muslim boy. He eventually escapes with the boy.
So he experienced it firsthand.
He did, and his personal experience of being both a white slave and then later, profiting from the slave trade to the Americas, it just highlights how white slavery was very much still a reality as late as the mid-17th century. It operated alongside, sometimes intersecting with, the nascent transatlantic system.
And it wasn't just in North Africa or the Mediterranean world, right?
Yeah.
Involuntary servitude was rampant within the British Isles itself, fueling migration to the Americas.
That's absolutely right. Vagrant children, convicts, indentured servants, huge numbers were shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's that term duty boys, used for homeless kids from London sent to Virginia, supposedly for apprenticeship, but often sold into really brutal field labor.
And Defoe himself commented on this.
He did. Daniel Defoe, observing their conditions, called them more properly called slaves because the harshness and often the permanence of their servitude was so extreme.
So in early America, while the legal framework around slavery was increasingly racialized, solidifying black Africans as chattel for life, there was still this backdrop of harsh, often lifelong servitude that wasn't solely based on race or skin color. Many early laborers were effectively bound white servants.
Correct. And early American thinkers were grappling with the emerging identity in this very complex context. Crèvecoeur, for instance, in his famous Letters from an American Farmer, painted this optimistic picture of the American as a new man.
But his view changed.
Dramatically. Later, when visiting Charleston, he was deeply shocked. He became incredibly pessimistic about the casual cruelty of the wealthy slaveholders there. He saw the institution of slavery as fundamentally corrupting to white people themselves. He argued it made them insensible to justice and humanity.
So it wasn't just about the impact on the enslaved, but what the institution of slavery did to the character, the soul of the enslaver.
Yeah.
Raising questions about the nature of white Americans themselves.
Exactly. And meanwhile, you have figures like Thomas Jefferson developing these very influential, though, historically contested, theories of American identity based on ancestry.
His Saxon ancestry idea.
Yes, he rooted American liberty and identity in a supposed pure Saxon bloodline and language, linked it to ancient Saxon institutions of freedom, and contrasted it sharply with what he saw as the historical burdens imposed by the Norman conquest in England, or the perceived political weakness of modern Germans.
And he even institutionalized the study of Anglo-Saxon at his university.
He did, at the University of Virginia, saw it as the root language of American culture and law, which is quite ironic given he hired a prominent German professor to actually teach it.
A fascinating detail. But not everyone agreed with Jefferson's narrow, sort of racialized views, right? Or his anti-black statements.
No, definitely not. Samuel Stanhope Smith, the president of Princeton at the time, was a prominent voice insisting on the unity of mankind. He directly criticized Jefferson's views and linked perceived human differences more to environment, climate, and the state of society, as he put it.
He compared different groups based on environment.
He did. He even went as far as comparing contemporary backcountry people, white settlers on the frontier, to Cherokees in their savageness, suggesting that environment and culture, not fixed race, were the key factors in explaining perceived differences.
And then you have powerful voices coming from the other side, those explicitly challenging the very idea of a positive inherent white identity or superiority.
David Walker's radical appeal to the colored citizens of the world, published in 1829, is a prime example. He offered a completely counter history, traced black identity to the glories of ancient Egyptians and white identity to what he called bloody, deceitful ancient Greece.
So he asserted fixed negative traits for whites.
Yes, claiming they were inherently unjust, jealous, unmerciful, avaricious, and bloodthirsty. He was essentially flipping the script of racial essentialism entirely, using the same kind of fixed trait language but assigning it negatively to whites.
A direct challenge.
Absolutely. A direct and potent challenge to any notion of inherent white superiority based on his deeply critical reading of history. His work was so incendiary, especially when smuggled into the South, that it led to violent backlash, book burnings, even death penalties for Black people found with it.
And this tension, this questioning of American identity and white character in the context of slavery and emerging race thinking, it continued with European observers commenting on America, didn't it?
Yes, Gustave de Beaumont's novel Marie, or Slavery in the United States, published in 1835, is crucial here. Often overlooked, especially compared to his friend Alexis de Tocqueville's much more famous Democracy in America.
How did their views differ?
Well, Beaumont, unlike Tocqueville, who kind of relegated the issue of race and slavery to footnotes or referred readers elsewhere, saw firsthand the deadly meaning of race prejudice dominating American society. He argued forcefully that American white people had created a hereditary aristocracy.
Not based on land or title.
No, based on a mythology of tainted blood and invisible ancestry. He believed this race-based system corrupted white Americans and destroyed the possibility of true democracy.
Which is a direct contradiction to Tocqueville's central focus on a virtuous American democracy rooted in equality.
Precisely. Beaumont put the issue of race, and specifically the corruption caused by white supremacy, front and center. He saw it as the defining corrupting feature of American society, directly challenging Tocqueville's core thesis.
It's quite telling, then, which narrative gained more traction initially.
It really is. Tocqueville's book was translated immediately into English, became hugely influential. Beaumont's more critical work. It took over a century to get an accessible English translation. Speaks volumes, perhaps.
Okay, so we've seen these early ideas linking traits to climate, status, politics, character. Then in early America, complex debates about national identity, the corrupting nature of slavery on whites, even radical challenges to white superiority. Now, the 19th century really sees the formal rise of what was presented as race science.
It really does, and it's fascinating that a kind of surprising starting point for shaping ideas about desirable human characteristics, which later fed into racial thinking, was aesthetics, specifically the appreciation of classical sculpture.
Right, Winckelmann and the white aesthetic.
Exactly. Johann Joachim Winckelmann, back in the 18th century, he developed this incredibly influential aesthetic based on the gleaming white marble Roman copies of Greek statues he saw in Rome. He either didn't know, or maybe deliberately ignored, the fact that the original Greek sculptures were often painted quite vividly colored.
But he elevated the white marble itself.
He did. Elevated it into an emblem of beauty and purity that he applied not just to art, but held up as an ideal for all of humanity. And this white aesthetic had a really lasting influence.
How so?
For centuries, museums and art education used white plaster casts of classical sculpture, deliberately leaving them unpainted. It perpetuated Winckelmann's idea that white was the most beautiful, the ideal, the original color. It subtly reinforced an association of whiteness with classical beauty and civilization.
Beyond aesthetics, the 19th century saw this huge push to make race classification seem scientific, often through measurement, right?
Oh, yes. This is where figures like Blumenbach come in.
Yeah.
Often considered a founder of physical anthropology, he was a giant in the field and truly believed measurement could reveal fundamental racial truths. He built this enormous collection of human skulls from all over the world, his Golgotha, as he called it.
And cranial measurement became key.
It became seen as the scientific tool. Things like the cephalic index, basically measuring head shape and proportions, were used to classify humanity into distinct groups.
There was even that bizarre debate among French anthropologists about whether German head size meant German brains were bigger, and therefore Germans were smarter than the French.
Yes. A serious debate in the 1860s between figures like Paul Broca and Armand de Quatrefages, arguing intensely over what these measurements signified about national or racial capabilities. The debate wasn't really resolved by the measurements themselves, which kind of highlights how arbitrary and ethnocentric these supposed scientific metrics could be, often used to just reinforce pre-existing biases.
And Blumenbach himself classified humans into these varieties.
He did. Initially 4, later 5, Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and then he added Malay. But he was constantly revising his classifications as more people from different parts of the world were encountered. It really shows the inherent difficulty, the chaos almost, that increasing discovery brought to these attempts at rigid classification.
He even included lapse as white eventually.
Yes. and noted some were considered beautiful in form, showing just how subjective even these scientific observations could be. His focus was mainly on physical characteristics and measurement, which contrasts with figures like Miners, who relied much more heavily on subjective, often negative, ethnocentric travel literature to describe and categorize groups. Miners was much more explicit than Blumenbach, using perceived inferiority and ugliness to openly justify slavery and despotism.
So beauty, skulls, climate, geography, perceived temperament, they were all being thrown into the mix, sometimes interchangeably, to create these classifications and hierarchies. And European ideas were heavily influencing the thinking in America.
Absolutely. Madame de Staël, a very influential French writer in the early 19th century, classified European races into Latin, German, and Slav based on a mix of culture, climate, language, history. She was particularly influential in linking modern Germans to ancient Greeks, promoting this idea that Germans were somehow the modern heirs to classical civilization.
And Thomas Carlyle took this kind of thinking in a particularly harsh direction regarding the Irish, didn't he?
Oh, Carlyle. Known for his often virulent writings, he notoriously described the Irish as white chimpanzees, saw them as animalistic, lacking the historical agency and industriousness he attributed to his idealized Saxons and Teutons.
He even compared them unfavorably to black people in the West Indies.
He did. Suggested black laborers there worked harder than the Irish peasantry, referred to Ireland as a black Ireland. This kind of dehumanizing language, unfortunately, wasn't uncommon when classifying groups perceived as inferior, even those considered nominally white.
And this fed directly into a really virulent nativist backlash in America.
Yes, absolutely. Against the surge of Irish Catholic immigrants in the mid-19th century, you see the rise of the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic Know-Nothing Party. And prominent figures like Samuel F.B. Morse, yes, the inventor of the telegraph, and Lyman Beecher, a leading minister, publishing these fierce anti-Catholic tracts, alleging European and papal conspiracies to undermine American liberties through mass immigration. These groups, while nominally white, were seen as a profound threat to the existing white American identity.
Meanwhile, American intellectuals were developing their own influential theories of racial identity, often building on these European ideas. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example.
Emerson was hugely influential with his Anglo-Saxonism, particularly in his book English Traits. He defined the ideal American and Englishman as embodying the virile, handsome Norseman, a category into which he kind of selectively lumped Jutes, Norse, and Saxons.
But he excluded the Irish.
Crucially, yes, explicitly excluded the Celtic Irish from this ideal, viewing them as fundamentally different and inferior. He also viewed Germans and Asians as lacking political greatness, attributing it to a fundamental defect of will. For Emerson, the key to American identity and strength lay in this supposedly powerful, even brutal Norse ancestry.
So even within the broad category of perceived European whiteness, there were very clear hierarchies and exclusions being drawn, defining who was the right kind of white person.
Definitely. The boundaries were constantly being policed, debated, and then you have figures like Robert Chambers, whose popular book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, presented a unified evolutionary view, but was still, ambivalent about human brotherhood and noted environmental influence on appearance, even contrasting Americans and the English.
But the dominant American school of anthropology really doubled down on fixed biological hierarchy, didn't it?
Oh, yes. That school was centered around figures like Samuel George Morton. His extensive work relied almost entirely on skull measurement, explicitly aiming to use quantitative data to prove permanent God-given racial hierarchies with Caucasians firmly at the top.
And he famously tried to link ancient Egypt to white superiority.
Yes, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. He even claimed that depictions of woolly hair in Egyptian art were just wigs worn over straight hair, all to maintain the narrative of white achievement.
That certainly sounds like forcing the evidence to fit a predetermined theory.
It absolutely was. Morton was also a strong proponent of polygenesis, the controversial idea that different races were created separately by God rather than originating from a single human pair. His work was incredibly influential in America.
And his successors carried this on.
They did. Figures like Josiah Nott and Louis Agassiz continued to promote these ideas of fixed racial types and hierarchies. Agassiz, especially, was a prominent anti-Darwinian polygenist who influenced American anthropology significantly from his position at Harvard.
So even Darwin's theory of evolution, proposing a single origin for all humanity, didn't immediately dismantle these American race science ideas.
Well, Dartway's work did challenge polygenesis by proposing monogenesis a single origin. Agassiz, for his part, famously rejected Darwinism entirely, sticking to separate creations. But the underlying racist notions, the belief in fixed, unchanging racial identity determining character and capacity that persisted long after the specific scientific justifications were challenged or debunked, the idea itself held sway.
Okay, so the 19th century really solidified these pseudoscientific justifications for racial hierarchy and exclusion, creating layers of distinction even within groups considered broadly white. Now, let's move into the early 20th century, a period marked by massive immigration and a lot of resulting anxiety that really shaped the boundaries of whiteness again.
Right. This era saw what some historians call the second enlargement of American whiteness. By the mid-19th century, formal legal and political whiteness, things like voting rights for white men regardless of property, was relatively established. But social belonging, being truly American, that was still heavily restricted, particularly for the waves of new immigrants arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe.
And military service was sometimes seen as a potential pathway into this white American club.
Exactly. Some saw immigrant military service, particularly during conflicts like the Civil War, as a kind of baptism of blood, consecrating them as citizens, integrating them. Others, however, saw immigrant soldiers merely reinforcing existing white supremacy by fighting for the Union cause. So, different perspectives there.
The anxiety really escalated dramatically, though, with the increasing flow of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Groups like Italians, Jews, Slavs.
Yes, this led to widespread social and political anxieties. And the rise of concepts like Francis Amasa Walker's race suicide thesis, which he popularized around 1901.
What was his argument, basically?
He argued that competition from these new immigrants, whom he often described dismissively as degraded peasantry, was leading to declining birth rates among native whites. And he defined those native whites as people of homogeneous British stock. His argument was that the superior native stock was shrinking from competition with this supposedly inferior new influx.
So earlier immigrant groups, like the Irish or Germans who faced discrimination in the 19th century, were now starting to be categorized as part of the threatened native stock, contrasting themselves with the new immigrants.
It was a fluid and politically motivated shift in definition, yes. Walker was often a bit slippery about where exactly that line fell, but it was clearly intended to exclude Southern and Eastern Europeans. And theorists like William Z. Ripley were providing the supposed scientific basis for these distinctions.
With his classification of European races.
Right. Teutonic or Nordic, Alpine, and Mediterranean. Based primarily on metrics like the cephalic index, that head shape measurement we mentioned. He presented these classifications as undeniable scientific fact.
But then you have pivotal figures like Franz Boas, who started to really challenge these prevailing scientific orthodoxies around race.
Boas was a truly transformative figure in anthropology. He began arguing forcefully that race, culture, and language were separate, independent variables, fundamentally challenging the deeply ingrained idea that they were inherently linked or determined by biology.
He doubted the existence of fixed European races.
He did. And questioned the scientific validity and reliability of metrics like the cephalic index as measures of race. His groundbreaking studies on immigrant body forms even showed that physical characteristics of groups like Southern Italians and Eastern European Jews actually changed over generations in America, suggesting plasticity rather than fixed types.
So he was providing empirical evidence directly against the fixed biological view of race that underpinned all that race science.
Yes, he was building the foundation for dismantling it. But it's important to note, even Boas initially expressed some ambivalence and concern about the influx of types distinct from our own, like Italians, Jews, and Slavs. It shows how pervasive those anxieties were. His own mentor, Virchow, had already grown skeptical that measurements like head shape yielded much insight beyond showing that language, culture, and body type didn't correlate neatly.
And Boas focused his big studies precisely on the groups seen as most threatening by the race suicide proponents.
He did. Southern Italians, Eastern European Jews, directly confronting the prevailing narrative with data.
And that anti-immigrant sentiment wasn't just academic. It was fueling real-world discrimination, social exclusion, and violence, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You see the escalation of restrictive policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act, widespread violence against Chinese immigrants and Native Americans, and a sharp rise in anti-Semitism across American society.
Like the Seligman incident.
Right. In 1877, where a wealthy Jewish financier was notoriously refused admission to a hotel, that highlighted the social barriers. But there were also violent riots against Jewish workers, and prominent educated Americans like Henry Adams openly voiced these stereotypical and conspiratorial notions of Jewish financial control.
And political figures were echoing and amplifying these race-based ideas as well.
Theodore Roosevelt, for instance, he frequently spoke of the American race, or our race, often in a context of national strength and expansion. He linked American frontier figures and expansionism to idealized Norse sea rovers and Vikings, explicitly drawing on Emerson and Carlyle's valorization of virile, sometimes brutal energy as foundational to Anglo-Saxon identity.
So even as some scientific voices like Boas started pushing back, the idea of racial hierarchy and difference, based on supposedly fixed group traits, remain deeply entrenched in popular and political discourse.
Absolutely. Older generation anthropologists like Daniel Brinton explicitly rejected Boas's ideas, asserting that inherent anatomical differences meant lower capacity for non-whites. And John W. Burgess, a prominent political scientist, a colleague of Boas at Columbia actually, publicly denounced immigration as polluting America with non-Aryan elements. This kind of explicitly racist rhetoric was far louder and more politically influential than Boas' careful critiques initially.
This period, roughly 1917 to 1921, is also sometimes called the Great Unrest, isn't it? What's going on?
Yeah, that era saw intense labor strikes, racial conflict, and huge fear sparked by the Russian Revolution. It really heightened existing anxieties. Fear of immigrants, particularly radical or working-class immigrants, became tightly linked to fears of political radicalism, disease, and national race degeneration.
You see that in the media at the time.
Definitely. Saturday evening post-cartoons from the time vividly illustrate this, showing immigrants bringing Bolshevism and lowered standards to America.
And W.B. Du Bois offered a profound critique of what he saw in this era, particularly in the context of World War I.
Yes, Du Bois argued powerfully that the war didn't represent Europe suddenly gone mad, but rather revealed the real soul of white culture. A culture, he argued, founded on racial domination and violence that had now turned on itself. It was a stark critique suggesting that the civilization supposedly represented by these Teutonic white peoples was fundamentally flawed, capable of immense savagery.
So if even supposedly superior white civilization could descend into that kind of conflict, maybe the whole idea of a superior white race was fundamentally flawed.
Exactly. But many Americans interpreted the unrest and perceived failures of the era through a racial lens, feels about who was truly American, whose genes were fit, rather than through a class or political one. The popular melting pot idea, which optimistically suggested immigrants would safely assimilate, was clearly struggling to contain these new, intense fears about racial dilution and degeneration.
And figures like Edward A. Ross, who popularized race suicide, were describing these new immigrants with incredibly derogatory terms, reinforcing the idea of inherent inferiority.
Ross described new immigrants as the Caliban type, referencing Shakespeare's monstrous character, suggested they belonged in primitive conditions. He explicitly asserted that race purity produced beauty, while mixing led to ugliness and a chaotic constitution. Just blatant stuff.
Then the ideas got even more extreme, didn't they? With figures like Lapouge.
Yes, Georges Vacher de Lapouge, a French follower of the earlier race theorist Gobineau. He believed the Aryan race was in decline due to mixing. He took anthroposociology, the attempt to link physical characteristics to social traits, to real extremes. He saw Jews as a primary competitor group lacking military or political spirit, and viewed rapidly multiplying Alpines, another of Ripley's categories, as the biggest problem for the Aryan race because of their perceived docility and mediocrity.
And these ideas directly influenced Madison Grant's famous book.
Directly. Grant's highly influential 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, argued for preserving the Nordic race against mixing. It built directly on Lapouge and also drew on earlier degenerate family studies like the Jukes, which linked poverty and social problems to supposedly inherited traits. Grant's book was so openly pro-German, promoting Nordics as the superior race, that it actually had to be revised after World War I to tone down that sentiment.
And Grant's work connected with influential figures like Henry Ford.
It did. Henry Ford's virulent anti-Semitism, promoted through his newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, and the widely distributed The International Jew, which popularized the fraudulent protocols of the Elders of Zion, added these new twists to the politics of race in America.
How so?
Well, while ostensibly focusing on Jews, he linked them not only to global finance and unions, but even bizarrely to the migration of Black people from the South. It's striking how his anti-Semitic tracts targeted white people Jews as a fundamental racial problem threatening America. It just shows how fluid and politically constructed these racial categories could be, and these ideas were often spread visually too, using charts, tables, illustrations, and books to lend them a scientific appearance.
And all these ideas, the supposed science, the social anxieties, the political rhetoric, the stereotypes, the visual propaganda, they had a very real, concrete legislative outcome, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. They culminated directly in the highly restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s. Figures like Harry H. Laughlin from the Eugenics Record Office actively lobbied Congress as a purported scientific expert.
Using flawed data.
Yes, using distorted results from flawed intelligence tests, like the Army tests given during WWI, which wrongly concluded immigrant groups showed widespread intellectual inferiority. He used this to argue for drastic restriction based on race.
And this directly led to the passage of laws designed to curb immigration from specific regions.
Exactly. The Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, and especially the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. The 1924 Act was specifically designed to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe by using the 1890 census as the basis for national quotas.
A census taken before the peak of immigration from those regions.
Precisely. A deliberate move to restrict those groups. And these discriminatory race-based quotas remained largely in place until 1965.
And this era also saw a massive resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan.
Right. The 1920s Klan was a huge national phenomenon. They expanded their targets beyond Black people to include Catholics, Jews, foreigners, and organized labor. Their estimated 5 million members across the country vividly reflected how widespread these anti-immigrant and race-based fears were. They often viewed groups like Black Americans or Catholic immigrants as an alien race, fundamentally outside the category of true Americans.
So the first few decades of the 20th century solidified a legal and social definition of whiteness that was incredibly exclusive, based on these shifting pseudoscientific notions and fueled by intense anxiety over immigration and social change. It effectively restricted who could fully belong to the American race.
Precisely. The lines were drawn very sharply, even among people who might physically appear quite similar.
Okay, now let's move into the mid to late 20th century, a period where we start seeing significant challenges to this whole edifice of race science, particularly, maybe, after the horrors of Nazism became widely known.
Yeah, a crucial figure here is Ruth Benedict, a prominent student of Franz Boas. Her book, Race, Science, and Politics, published in 1940, right as war was engulfing Europe, was incredibly clear and impactful.
What was her main argument?
She explicitly distinguished between race, which she argued was a complex matter for scientific study, and racism, which she defined as an unproved assumption. A belief system, essentially, not a scientific finding.
So she was saying basically believing that races exist is one thing, but believing some races are inherently better or worse than others. That's just baseless prejudice, not science.
Yes, exactly. And she insisted that culture and language were completely separate from biological race. She argued forcefully that groups like Italians, Jews, or the British were not distinct races in any biological sense.
And the rise of Nazism influenced this thinking.
Definitely. The horrifying rise of Nazism in Germany and its genocidal anti-Semitic persecution played a huge role in galvanizing scholars like Boas and Benedict. It pushed them into outspoken anti-racist activism. Benedict, who initially questioned Boas's earlier activism as maybe a distraction from pure science, changed her view dramatically in the face of Nazi ideology and its consequences.
And we see these ideas and anxieties about racial threats reflected in the culture of the time too, right? Like in literature.
Absolutely. Think of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel, The Great Gatsby. The character Tom Buchanan, representing the anxieties of the established elite, explicitly references racist eugenics ideas he's read.
The Rise of the Colored Empires book.
Right, by a fictional Goddard, clearly echoing real eugenicists like Lothrop Stoddard. And Tom expresses his fear that the white race will be utterly submerged by what he calls colored empires. This wasn't just a literary flourish. It directly mirrored the very real anxieties prevalent among certain segments of society about new immigrants and non-white groups supposedly taking over.
The political landscape during the mid-century was pretty complex too, wasn't it? trying to balance diverse interests while often maintaining existing racial hierarchies.
Yeah, the New Deal Coalition, for example. It held together a diverse array of groups: urban ethnic working classes, Southern white Democrats. It did so partly by compromising with or actively maintaining segregation and discrimination.
Like with Social Security.
Exactly. Policies like Social Security initially excluded farm and domestic workers categories where Black Americans were heavily represented. This effectively prioritized the interests of Southern white supremacist Democrats over the needs and rights of Black voters. And the U.S. military remained segregated right through World War II.
Were there alternative visions of American identity or inclusion emerging during this time?
Yes, there were. Horace Kallen's concept of cultural pluralism, which he articulated way back in 1915, envisioned America not as a melting pot where distinct identities dissolved, but more like an orchestration of mankind, an ensemble of distinct ethnic groups coexisting and contributing.
But his vision was limited.
Initially, yes, largely limited to purely European civilization. He didn't really include non-European groups in his original framework.
And what about Louis Adamic? He became a prominent spokesman for immigrants in the 1930s.
Adamic's work, like The Native's Return and his essays on 30 Million New Americans, was really important in popularizing the idea that immigrant groups had made significant contributions to America. But even he showed some ambivalence.
That's so.
He often viewed second-generation immigrant children as a problem because they frequently felt inferior, caught between their parents' old world and an American society that still saw their distinct racial identities as separating them from Native Americans. He described their feelings of inferiority and alienation very vividly.
So even a proponent of immigrant inclusion struggled with the reality of how they were perceived and integrated.
It highlights just how deeply entrenched the idea of a normative, exclusive American identity really was. But there were positive shifts promoting diversity too, like the Americans All Immigrants All radio series produced by the U.S. Office of Education in the late 1930s.
What did that do?
It was a pioneering effort that integrated the histories and contributions of various American groups, including ethnic whites, Black Americans, others, into a national narrative. Although even that faced initial resistance, NBC actually refused to air it at first due to perceived controversy.
So it seems the mid-century consensus, despite these challenges and alternative ideas, was still pretty rigid about who counted as truly American.
Yes, fundamentally, the figure of the normative American was still understood primarily as being of European heritage. Black people, Native Americans, Asian Americans, they were largely relegated to separate lower compartments, not fully considered part of the national identity. And this was reinforced not just in policy, but in popular culture, magazines, advertising, often portraying this idealized, implicitly superior Anglo-Saxon image.
But after World War II, particularly with the economic boom and suburbanization, there's another major shift in how whiteness functions in American society, isn't there? A sort of enlargement.
Yeah, this is what some describe as the fourth enlargement of American whiteness. Federal policies after the war, crucially programs like the FHA and VA mortgage programs, made suburban homeownership accessible to millions. However,
there was a catch.
A huge catch. Due to discriminatory lending practices and housing covenants, these benefits overwhelmingly flowed to white families. They actively excluded Black Americans and other minority groups from purchasing homes in these new developments. This fueled rapid suburban growth and led to a strong, consequential conflation of white and middle class.
Effectively creating a kind of intergenerational wealth and social status that was largely inaccessible to Black families, trapping many in urban areas that were often undergoing deindustrialization at the same time.
Exactly. It helped solidify white and middle class as almost synonymous in the public imagination, creating experiences like that Italian-American woman DeSalvo mentioned in the sources. She became middle class in the suburbs, lost her grandparents' language, aspects of her specific ethnic identity, but found she had far more in common socially and economically with her Jewish or Irish neighbors in the suburbs than with her working-class cousins back in the old neighborhood. She gained access to American whiteness and the privileges of middle-class status.
And this new suburban middle-class whiteness stood in stark contrast to the image of the Black ghetto that increasingly emerged from deindustrialization and housing discrimination in urban centers.
Precisely. Black Americans in these areas were increasingly conflated, both in the public mind and in sociological literature, with earlier negative ideas of degenerate families and alien races, reinforcing the idea of inherent inferiority linked to location and circumstance.
And the civil rights movement, of course, was a direct powerful protest against this entire historical system of racial discrimination and exclusion.
Absolutely. And the Kerner Commission report in 1968 laid out the systemic issues clearly, detailed the history of policy and practice that created the two societies separate and unequal. But many suburbanites, living in their increasingly segregated world, remain disconnected from these realities, often seeing only Black people acting out in urban uprisings without understanding the deep historical roots.
This period also sees the rise of Black nationalism and its significant engagement with academic thought and critiques of American society.
Yes, absolutely. Figures like Malcolm X, James Baldwin, and others actively engage with sociological and psychological ideas about identity and oppression. Baldwin, for example, offered this profound critique of white Americans' spurious and, he argued, inauthentic relationship to Europe and their own history.
What was his argument about immigrants?
He argued forcefully that second-generation immigrants, in particular, paid the price of losing their genuine ethnic identity as the cost of admission to American whiteness, which required them, he believed, to embrace the nation's history of white supremacy and anti-Black racism to fully belong. Thinkers influenced by academics like Erik Erikson's work on identity formation also contributed to how these movements understood the psychological impact of racial identity and oppression.
And sociologists were grappling with the persistence of ethnic identity in cities rather than complete assimilation.
Yes. Glaser and Moynihan's influential 1963 book Beyond the Melting Pot, focusing on New York City, argued that ethnic groups weren't simply melting away. They were being continually recreated by new experiences in America, persisting as distinct social units.
But their views evolved.
Well, it's worth noting that Moynihan later contributed to the problematic degenerate families literature regarding Black families, unfortunately, and Glaser shifted from opposing discrimination to opposing affirmative action. It highlights the evolving and sometimes contradictory views even among those studying these dynamics.
This era also saw political strategies explicitly leveraging racial tensions and anxieties to reshape political coalitions, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. George Wallace's overtly anti-Black stance, Nixon's calculated Southern strategy, Reagan's effective use of language focused on work, family, neighborhood language that resonated powerfully with a sense of threatened white racial identity and perceived decline of traditional values.
These were all ways of appealing to voters based on perceived racial differences and anxieties.
Yes, often pitting ethnic white working class voters who felt their status was threatened against perceived Black degenerate families. Books like Michael Novak's The Unmeltable Ethnics reflected this idea, focusing on white ethnic groups who saw themselves as distinct from and sometimes opposed to Black Americans.
And the way the government officially categorized people started to change dramatically post-civil rights.
Yes. With the passage of civil rights legislation, the focus shifted. It moved from legally enforced separation to collecting data for tracking discrimination and ensuring compliance. Statistical Policy Directive 15, issued in 1977, mandated common racial and ethnic categories for the census and all federal agencies for civil rights enforcement purposes.
So it was a shift from segregation to categorization for monitoring.
Exactly. It moved away from the old segregationist legal framework, but it also created new forms of categorization. And as some observers noted, a certain level of complexity and even chaos in classification as these categories were debated and revised over time.
So by the late 20th century, the legal landscape had changed dramatically, outlawing explicit racial discrimination. But the idea of race and the specific idea of whiteness remained incredibly powerful, shaped by this long, complex history of construction, contestation, and shifting boundaries.
Precisely. The mechanisms changed, maybe, but the idea persisted with very real-world effects.
So let's bring this right up to the present day, real close to it. What does this incredibly long, detailed history of constructing and redefining whiteness ultimately tell us? What's the big takeaway?
I think it emphasizes fundamentally that the definition and boundaries of whiteness have never been fixed, timeless, or, frankly, biological in the way people thought. They have been historically constructed, incredibly fluid, and constantly reshaped over centuries.
Reshaped by social, economic, political forces.
Right, and by migration, conflict, changing ideas about who belongs. The lines of inclusion and exclusion have shifted dramatically over time, often based on criteria that seem arbitrary now: climate, political system, language, head shape, perceived beauty, economic status.
All used to create and justify hierarchies and power structures, linking things like status, intelligence, character, political fitness to these perceived racial traits.
Exactly. The history reveals this continuous, sometimes contradictory process of defining who is in and who is out of the category of white, and how that definition served various purposes, particularly in maintaining social order and power structures, often, of course, at the expense of those excluded.
And this brings us back to that core foundational idea we started with. Race is an idea. It's a social construct, not a biological fact in the way it has historically been conceived and used.
Yes, and contemporary biology and genetics are unequivocally clear on this point. Modern science does not support the concept of distinct physical human races as envisioned by historical race science based on visible traits like skin color or skull measurements. That whole framework is scientifically obsolete.
Genetic evidence confirms that human variation exists, of course, but it doesn't sort neatly into the categories of race historically defined by societies like the American one, does it?
Correct. Genetic studies confirm humans are not divided into biological races. The genetic differences between individuals within any given population group are often greater than the average differences between groups traditionally labeled as races. There's more genetic variation within a supposed race than between them on average.
So from a scientific standpoint, the old categories of race, the ones used to build those hierarchies, they're just invalid.
Biologically speaking, yes. However, and this is the crucial point highlighted by this whole history, despite the scientific consensus that biological races don't exist, the idea of race persists. And the belief in racism, the belief that races exist and that some are inherently better or worse than others, continues to have immense real-world power and influence. It shapes societies, institutions, people's lives today. The social construct has factual consequences.
It's a powerful, enduring idea, isn't it? A social concept with profound factual impacts, even without a biological foundation.
It really is. This history shows us just how deeply ingrained these ways of thinking became and how resilient the idea can be, even when its supposed biological basis is completely refuted.
This has been an incredible, detailed journey through the history of a concept, the idea of whiteness, which, as you said, is a social construct, but one that has shaped so much of the factual world we inhabit, from laws and policies to social interactions and identity itself.
And understanding this history, how the idea of whiteness was constructed, how its boundaries shifted, and how it was used to include, exclude, justify social structures, it's absolutely vital, I think, for making sense of so many contemporary issues. Issues around identity, inequality, social relations, both in America and really beyond.
So how does knowing this long, often surprising, and very detailed history of the idea of race, and specifically the idea of whiteness, how does that resonate with your own understanding of identity, society, history? How does knowing that race is an idea with this traceable history of being defined and redefined change the way you think about the world around you and the categories we often just take for granted?
Well, it encourages a deep level of critical perspective, doesn't it? It reminds us that categories we often treat as natural or fixed and which have very real effects actually have specific histories. They've been created and used for particular purposes, often linked to power dynamics.
Which leaves us with a really powerful thought to consider, drawing from this long history in modern science. Given this detailed history of fluid definitions, shifting boundaries, exclusion, and the undeniable modern scientific understanding that biological races don't exist in the way they were conceived, what does the continued persistence of racial categories and racial thinking tell us about the enduring power of ideas themselves, even when they lack a biological or factual basis?
That's the question, isn't it?
What does it mean to navigate a world where the idea of race still has such profound factual consequences for individuals and societies?
It's a question that really compels us to look beyond simple biological definitions, I think, to understand the social, the historical, the political forces that keep the idea of race alive and powerful. And it requires ongoing critical reflection and engagement with both history and contemporary society. There's always more to unpack.